Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Widow's Fate by Emma Ashwood. Prologue. Tammy only had to hear the front door slam to know that her father was in one of his moods. That was how she and her mother referred to it when drink drowned out all the happiness from his life. She flinched even as the door creaked, as if sighing with relief that it had survived the assault. She didn't dare look over her shoulder, knowing that when her father reeked of rum and his feet dragged on the wooden floor, a simple glance was likely to set him off. It wasn't that Tony Anderson was a bad person. It was just a matter of getting mixed up with the wrong crowd. Ever since Tammy could remember, her father had worked in one of the sugar factories close to the harbor. But as of late, the factory at which her father worked no longer just worked the sugar that was imported from the sugar islands in the Caribbean. New direction meant the opening of a distillery to distill the byproduct of sugar, molasses, into rum. Her parents had sat her down a few years ago to explain that this would mean great things for their family. With the factory turning to distilling, it would mean more wages and a better life for them. But what her parents hadn't mentioned was that rum was a seductress that didn't easily let her victims go. Tammy had stopped counting the number of times she had prayed that her father would quit and find another job. Because with the increase in wages and the distillery opening at the factory, her father's weakness for alcohol had been revealed. Some might admire the aroma of rum, but Tammy detested it. For her, it was the aroma her father carried like cologne when he returned from work. It was the source of his constant anger and the hollowness in his eyes. Rum was the reason he hardly ate anymore, and it was also the reason that they hardly felt the increase in wages. The owner of the distillery had been clever enough to give the men a choice: extra earnings in cash or rum. It wasn't hard to guess which option her father had chosen. "Where's my dinner?" her father demanded, shuffling in a stumble to the dinner table. Tammy's heart was racing in her chest as she drew a calming breath. "It's almost ready, Pa. I'm just waiting on the potatoes." "You call yourself a woman? You can't even have dinner on the table when it's time for supper," her father slurred, slamming his fist on the table. "Tony, you've had a long day. Why don't you lie down for a little while, and I'll help Tammy to get your dinner on the table?" Tammy's mother offered quietly as she moved to her father's side. This was another occurrence that had become more and more frequent over the last few years. Her mother trying to shield her from her father's wrath. "I don't need a lie down. I need proper women who know how to care for a man." Tony cursed under his breath. "I spend all day at the distillery, and you two sit here doing nothing. Then I come home and you want to treat me like a child. Enough." It happened so fast. Tammy didn't even see his hand strike out. She just saw her mother flinch before she rushed to their bedroom. Tammy didn't hesitate. She rushed after her mother to see if she was all right, hating her father for what he had become. She found her mother in tears on the bed. "Ma?" "Tammy, it's nothing. He's just tired. He's not thinking. He's in one of his moods again." Her mother began making the usual excuses. 3 or 4 years ago, those excuses might have worked, but Tammy was older now. She also wasn't blind. She let out a heavy sigh. "Ma, he's not in a mood and he didn't have a bad day. He's drunk. You and I both know where those extra wages are going, and we both know why he's always late. He's not going to change, Ma." "It's time I think we should leave," Tammy said confidently, although her knees were quivering at the thought of running away. Her mother's eyes shot up and met Tammy's. "How dare you suggest such a thing? He's your pa. He's the one that puts the food in your belly and the clothes on your back. A woman doesn't criticize Tamara. It's time you learned that. A woman supports her husband and father. That's the way it is." Tammy took a step back, shocked that her mother could defend his actions with such ferocity. "But Ma, he hurts us. That isn't the way it should be." "How do you know how it should be? It's the way it is. You hear me. Now go finish dinner before you anger him even more," her mother said sternly. Tammy headed back to the kitchen only to find her father asleep on his arms at the table. His snores filled the kitchen, and although it was disturbing, at least he wasn't looking for trouble. As she finished dinner, she found herself praying once more for God's help. Like so many times before, Tammy prayed for guidance, for deliverance from the man she called her pa, and for a future without conflict, abuse, or hard words. Her mother finally joined her in the kitchen and helped Tammy to plate the dinner. It was a meager dinner of potatoes, ham left over from the night before, and pumpkin that Tammy had managed to buy with the money she had earned from sewing the neighbor's dock uniform. At exactly 7 o'clock, Tammy glanced out the window when said neighbor arrived home. Some nights, not every night, but sometimes the other man would come with. She couldn't remember his name, but he had smiled and greeted her a few times in the past. He was as tall as a tree with arms as broad as branches. His eyes were ice blue and his smile seemed kind. Tammy didn't know him very well, but whenever she spotted him through the window, her heart skipped a beat. Once, a few months ago, he had asked her to go for a walk with him, but Tammy had quickly declined because at that moment her father had arrived home. The last thing Tammy wanted was for the handsome man to meet her father. Although she was 18 years old, she had yet to begin courting. There had been a few men who had paid interest to her in the past, but Tammy always turned them away. Not because she didn't want a husband and a family, but simply because she knew once they met her father, they would run for the hills. Right then, he turned and looked right at her. Her cheeks flushed with pleasure before she quickly looked away. He looked even more handsome tonight than he had the last time. "Tony, dinner is ready," her mother said, touching her father's shoulder. Tammy set the plates on the table and took her seat. She glanced cautiously at her father to see if his short nap had eased his bad mood. His eyes were drawn as he began poking around the plate with his fork. "What is this?" Tammy swallowed past the fear before she spoke. When her father asked that, it was only a moment before he would lose his patience. "It's potatoes, pumpkin, and yesterday's ham." Her father tossed his plate against the wall, sending the food flying before he stood up and stalked toward Tammy. "How many times did I tell you that I don't eat pumpkin? You cooked it just to spite me, didn't you?" Tammy tried to shove her chair back, but it fell and Tammy fell back onto it, her breath knocked out. Just as she tried to catch her breath, she saw her father towering over her, anger and hate in his eyes. "You'll pay for thinking you can mock me." "I wasn't mocking you." Tammy began to plead when suddenly the door opened and the handsome man she had just spotted through the window stepped inside. "What's going on in here?" His voice boomed through their small apartment. Tammy didn't even know her eyes had widened as her father turned to the man with his fists raised. "None of your business, that's what." The man glanced at Tammy before checking her mother to spot the bruise on her cheek. "I'm sorry, sir, but I beg to differ. There's a girl lying winded on the floor and a woman standing in your kitchen with a bruised cheek. I'd say it's my business since I can't just walk away knowing you'll continue to do what you were just about to do." "You're looking for trouble, boy. Git." Tony's voice boomed once more. The man stayed in place with a brief shake of his head. "Ma'am, miss, would you like to come with me?" Tammy felt a flicker of hope spark in her heart for the first time in years when her mother's voice broke through quietly. "We're fine right here, thank you. I think it's best if you leave now." He shook his head before he turned to Tammy, who was still lying on the floor. For a moment, their eyes met, and Tammy couldn't help but feel as if this was God's way of answering her prayers when he walked towards her. He offered her his hand and helped her to her feet before searching her gaze. "If she won't leave, doesn't mean you don't have to. I'll make sure no harm comes to you, and you never have to come back here again." He glanced at Tony before meeting her gaze again. "You never have to see him again. All you have to do is say yes." Tammy hesitated for a moment, wondering if she would be surrendering herself to a worse fate, but something in the man's eyes spoke of kindness and goodness. She felt certain that she could trust him, and although that wasn't much to go on, it was a better option than staying. "Yes, Ma?" Her mother gasped even as her father began to curse. With the tall stranger by her side, Tammy ignored him and spoke to her mother again. "Ma, please, you have to come with me. You can't go on like this." "Tammy, you don't even know this man. Don't be ridiculous. Besides, your father just had a long day." Her mother defended him again. Tammy glanced at her father and sighed. "He's had a long day every day for the last 4 years. I can't stay, Ma. I can't." Her mother began to cry and her father began to shout, but all Tammy could hear was the stranger's voice as he spoke quietly. "I promise you'll be safe. It's not right what he's doing, and if she wants to stay, that's her choice. But it's time you made your own." Tammy nodded. She couldn't recall exactly what happened next, but she knew the stranger had his hand around her shoulder and was leading her out the door. She had nothing but her memories and the clothes on her back, and knew that she would never see her parents again. But with his arm around her shoulders, Tammy had never felt more protected or cared for. It just felt right. Chapter 1. The sun filtered through the clouds, its beams falling on the casket. For a moment, it brought a smile to Tammy's face. Wayne would have liked to know that the sun was shining and that he would be sent off on a sunny morning, she thought as the clouds parted even more. Although it was a beautiful morning in Boston, Tammy's heart ached knowing she was all alone in the world. For the last 7 years, Wayne White had been everything to her. She wiped away a tear as she thought about the day he had saved her from her father. That day would forever remain in her memories, although the memories that followed them were only sweet. Wayne had swiftly introduced himself after they had left the tenement apartments, before he explained that he would take her home to live with him and his mother. In Wayne's mother, Tammy had found a friend and a mother figure. Within days, she had felt welcomed and safe. Tammy still couldn't remember if she had fallen in love with Wayne through the windows of their tenement apartment, or on the night he appeared to rescue her, or because of the kind and generous way with which he welcomed her into his life. But needless to say, 6 months later they married and were more in love than ever before. They had lived an enchanted life, although they weren't wealthy by any means. His wages as a dock worker were more than enough to give them everything they needed. He was a hard worker and was promoted only a year into their marriage to shift manager, a well-earned position. Wayne's mother had taken her under her wing and helped Tammy to hone her needlework skills sufficiently for Tammy to be competent enough to find a position in a factory as a seamstress. The wages were meager compared to Wayne's, but Tammy enjoyed the company and the challenges brought by the new garments to be sewn. The breeze changed, making her wavy hair dance on her back. Tammy tucked her hair behind her ear and noticed that most of the funeral goers had left. She was standing all alone beside her husband's grave. She brushed away another tear before she allowed herself to think back on the wonderful 7 years she had shared with Wayne before his death. They had been married for almost 3 years when she learned she was with child. Tammy would never forget the happiness on her husband's face when she told him. Wayne had ecstatically expressed his hopes to have a little girl. And on the day of Lily's birth, it had been love at first sight. He had been the most wonderful father, although his fatherhood had been short-lived. The physicians couldn't tell them exactly why or what had happened, but only 7 days after her birth, Lily had taken ill with a fever. Regardless of their efforts to break the horrendous fever, they had lost Lily when she was only days old. For some couples, the death of a child might mean the end of a marriage, but for Wayne and Tammy, it had only brought them closer. Losing Lily had made them appreciate life and each other even more. Lily's passing affected Tammy in ways she never could have imagined. She had nightmares, even to this day, about her daughter. Every time, she would lose Lily all over again. When the nightmares came, only Wayne knew how to soothe her. Now Wayne was gone. Before his mother's passing, she had managed to console Lily as well. Tammy's heart ached at the thought of her mother-in-law. Although she had been of advanced years, Tammy hadn't thought she would succumb so quickly to scarlet fever. It had taken her in its clutches, and God had called her home only a few days later. That had been barely 6 months ago. Tammy was now all alone. She had lost Wayne and his mother, and although she still thought about her own parents now and then, she knew she was no longer welcome in their home. Now, m- just a year after her wedding, she had gone to see her mother to encourage her to leave the apartment and to move in with her and Wayne. Her mother had made it clear that she no longer had a daughter and that she never wanted to see Tammy again. Tammy vowed that day never to bother her mother again. She glanced at the casket and felt a heaviness settle on her shoulder. It had been an accident, the men from the shipping company had said, but Tammy still couldn't help but wonder if enough precautions had been taken to prevent it. Wayne had been a shift manager. He wasn't supposed to be loading and offloading crates. And yet when the cable snapped, he had been right there in harm's way. The shipping company had given her an envelope of money to compensate for her loss, but how could they ever allocate an amount in lieu of her husband's life? She hadn't used it. She hadn't even opened it, to be honest. Because what would she spend it on? She didn't have a family, and her wages were enough to cover her meals. But there was the rent, she reminded herself. The heating bill when winter came, she thought with a sigh. She couldn't keep living in their home on her wages, and even if she used the money in the envelope, what would she do when it was finished? "Tammy, come. I know it's hard, but we're going to be late," a female voice said as a hand gently rested on her shoulder. Tammy drew in a deep breath and glanced at her husband's grave one last time. She turned and smiled sadly at her friend and coworker. It might be her husband's funeral, but she couldn't afford to lose more wages. She walked away from the cemetery with a heavy heart, realizing she had nothing left in the world. She tried to console herself that she had been rescued and loved by a wonderful man, but even that felt hollow, knowing that he was gone. The beautiful life she had dreamed of for them had evaporated the moment the men from the shipping company had knocked on her door. She was now left without even Lily to remind her of the man she had loved so very much. In their place, she had 3 graves in a cemetery and an empty home. Tears slipped over her cheek as she walked back to the factory. She had her shift, she promised herself when she arrived. For now, all she could do was take life one shift at a time and pray that God had plans for her life. Plans that didn't include spending the rest of her life alone and living on the memories of the past. Chapter 2. Tammy closed the door behind her and for a moment thought of her last night at her parents' house. She had been thinking of them frequently since Wayne had passed away, not because she missed them or wished to reconnect, but because she realized just how grateful she was that Wayne had rescued her when he did. They might not have been blessed with the life they had dreamed of, and they might have suffered the horrible loss of a child, but at least they had 7 years of true love, the kind that Tammy already doubted she would ever find again. A cold chill traveled up her spine as she set her things down. It was unreasonably cold inside the small house that now belonged to her. To rephrase, she thought, the house to which the mortgage now belonged to her. She hadn't even known about the mortgage until Wayne had passed away. For some reason, she had thought it to be a rental. With all the costs mounting since the funeral and her insistence on saving the money the shipping company had given her, Tammy was hardly making ends meet. She had gone without the heating, knowing that it was useless to keep the house heated while she was at work anyway. She used that money instead to contribute to the mortgage payments. The funeral undertaker wasn't yet paid in full, and then there were all the other unexpected expenses following the funeral. Although Tammy was still working at the factory, her wages weren't enough to cover all her expenses. She had taken to only buying meat twice a week and could feel the resulting deficiency in the way her dresses draped loosely over her body. For extra money, she had sent out word that she was available to take in sewing in her free time. She was most fortunate that his had borne fruit. Every evening when she arrived home, just like tonight, she couldn't rest her body after a long shift at the factory. She had a pile of sewing waiting for her. Once she had brewed herself a pot of tea, Tammy headed to the pile and began with the item at the top. It was a dock worker's overall, much like the one Wayne used to wear. Tears burned her eyes, but she bit them back, knowing that she didn't have the time to mourn for Wayne, needing to put her time to making certain that she was in a position to feed herself. She worked with focus and care for the next few hours. When she stabbed herself with the needle for the 5th time, Tammy knew it was time to go to bed. Her eyes were heavy and her body was tired. She set the sewing aside and went to the pile of newspapers that she had brought home from the factory to fuel a fire in her fireplace, hoping the embers would last until morning to ward off the spring chill. Once she had placed a few logs in the fireplace, she began tearing pieces of newspaper and crumpling them into balls before tucking them between the logs. When she reached for the next paper, her eyes furrowed, the text bleary through her tired eyes. The Matrimonial Times, where willing husbands find good wives. Tammy was on the verge of accepting that she might be hallucinating thanks to weariness when she continued on to read the first advertisement. She had never seen such a thing before and couldn't help but be curious as to who at the factory could possibly have read such a paper. Before she realized it, her tiredness had disappeared and she was no longer aware of the cold. She was enthralled with the advertisements placed by men, introducing themselves and their reasons for seeking a wife. It was unlike anything Tammy had ever read before. All the more curious was the fact that all the men who were advertising for wives lived in the West. Everywhere from Colorado to California, even Texas. Tammy couldn't help but wonder about the type of woman who would answer an advertisement placed by a stranger clean across the country. Emma. They hailed from various backgrounds and different upbringings, and more importantly, they did not know each other at all. She tried to imagine whether she would be able to write to a complete stranger and laughed out loud knowing that it was a ridiculous thought. As she turned to the last page, she caught sight of the image of a couple in the right-hand corner with a headline that had her begin to read the article, Love Found on the Range. When April Harrington lost her mother, she was left all alone and with insurmountable debt. For more than a year, April scraped by with less than average wages, cutting down on not only her heating and food, but on any unnecessary costs. April turned to the Matrimonial Times as a last resort, in a bid not to find love, but a safe haven from the cruelty of poverty. She began corresponding with a horse rancher in California, Walter Abernathy, not believing that anything would come from their letters but false hope. When Walter proposed, April found herself eager to accept, not only because of the safety and comfort that Walter could offer her, but because she had developed a deep-seated affection for the stranger and his words. Now, 1 year later, Walter and April have celebrated their first anniversary. When corresponding, the happily wed couple stated that neither of them expected to find love. Walter was simply seeking companionship on his large ranch, and April a safe haven. What they found, however, was true love, and the couple are proud to announce that they will be expecting their firstborn child in the fall. April and Walter's story is one of many that give others hope. If you can't find love where you are, isn't it time you looked further? Isn't it time you looked in the Matrimonial Times? Tammy closed the paper and headed to bed. Lying in bed, though, April and Walter's story of love remained with her. She didn't expect to ever find love again, but could she become so desperate that she would seek a partner in life in the West? She fell asleep promising herself that she would find a way to make ends meet, but her dreams took another turn. In her dreams, she was climbing onto a train platform in a dusty small town. She felt fear coil in her belly, wondering if she had done the right thing. But the moment she saw him walking towards her, everything fell into place. He had green eyes and dusty blonde hair, his complexion tanned and leathery from the sun. All her doubts evaporated as Tammy realized she had finally found a second chance at love. It was the most restful sleep Tammy had enjoyed since standing beside her husband's grave. Chapter 3. As spring started to change into summer and new leaves burst forth with life on the trees, Tammy could recognize the changes in herself as well. As she walked home from the factory, she couldn't help but wonder how she would describe herself if she were a tree. Her hope sank into her shoes when she realized that she felt like a tree without leaves, water, or sunlight. a tree that was digging its roots into the earth, trying to hang on for dear life, but barely managing to survive. Over the last few weeks, she had taken in more private sewing jobs in a desperate attempt to make ends meet. Nonetheless, when the end of March was upon her and she had to pay the mortgage, she barely had enough money over for food. The house was too expensive, and Tammy was beginning to realize that just like she had to let go of Wayne, she was going to have to let go of the house sooner or later. She had to pay the mortgage again in a week, and it loomed over her like the dark cloud suffocating the tree inside her. Last night, she had finally given in and reached for the envelope that the shipping company had given her after Wayne's death. Tammy hadn't been sure what to expect, but she hadn't expected only 4 weeks' worth of wages. A sigh escaped her as she touched the money pouch in her pocket. She had enough to pay the mortgage the next week, but then the race for the next month's mortgage would kick off all over again. Tammy considered trying to pick up more shifts at the factory, but when she had asked, her shift manager had made it clear that if she took shifts over weekends, she would be taking work away from other women. Tammy hadn't pushed further. A soft drizzle began to fall, although the sun still shone through the clouds. Tammy glanced ahead and saw the small grocer on the corner and rushed in that direction. As soon as she was through the door, she let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't that she didn't like the rain, but more a matter of being concerned about how she would dry her clothes without heating. "Need anything, miss?" a toothless man asked from behind the counter. Tammy turned and saw him closing a newspaper, waiting for her reply. The name of the newspaper caught her eye, and a frown creased her brow. "Is that the latest edition?" "Yes, ma'am, just delivered today," the man said, pointing to a shelf of several freshly printed copies of the Matrimonial Times. Over the last 6 weeks, Tammy had been praying for God to send her a sign. She glanced out at the rain and thought of the envelope and the mortgage before she picked up a copy and walked to the store owner. "Just this, please." The man's brows rose, but Tammy didn't pay him any attention. She remembered April's story, and it hit her that her situation wasn't much different. She was all alone in the world without any hope for the future, and soon she would be penniless as well. Tammy handed the man the money, and filled with new hope, she rushed into the rain and set off at a brisk pace the rest of the way home. Once she had dried off and set a pot of tea on the wood stove, Tammy glanced at the newspaper that lay on the table. She couldn't imagine saying vows to another man after having lost Wayne such a short time ago. But if God had sent her a sign, then perhaps she just needed to take a look. As she began to read through the advertisements, she realized that most of the men advertising in the paper weren't necessarily looking for love. Some were looking for companionship, others searching for a mother for their children, and some simply needed someone to help them grow their homestead and build a life in the West. Tammy promised herself that just because she was considering becoming a mail-order bride didn't mean she was going to give her heart away. She could try and find a new life without minimizing Wayne's memory or the love they had shared. For the first time, Tammy began to understand why so many women married so soon after losing their husbands. Their reasons lay ultimately in the need for safety and security. Although she didn't want to see herself as a weakling, Tammy had to be honest with herself and admit that she couldn't promise that for herself. She turned the page, and an advertisement in the top right-hand corner immediately caught her eye. She read it twice before hope began to bloom in her chest. "The merchandiser needs a wife." Mr. Karl Gerber is a store owner and successful merchandiser in Texas. After focusing on growing his business and securing a place for himself in the local economy, Karl is ready to focus on the future. He describes himself as honest and steadfast, a kind man with a sharp sense of humor. He is looking for a wife who will understand the long hours expected of a merchandiser and will be willing to help when needed. Someone kind, someone thoughtful and gentle, someone who will appreciate the smaller things in life. Although he isn't wealthy by any means, he can offer his wife a beautifully quaint home and can provide for her. He dreams of having children and leaving his store to them one day. If you think that you are the right woman to share Karl's dreams of growing the business and a family, then don't hesitate to correspond today. Tammy wasn't sure why Karl's advertisement appealed to her, but something about it made her reach for a pen and paper. His advertisement wasn't dissimilar from most of the other advertisements, but the reassurance of a secure future with a hardworking man sounded exactly like what Tammy had been praying for. She tapped the pen against the page a few times, wondering how she was going to start a letter to a man she didn't know, a man she hoped would have her as his wife. Her thoughts went to Wayne. What would he have said? Would he have approved? Tammy felt a calmness envelop her as a smile curved her mouth. Wayne always said that when God hands you an opportunity, you'd be a fool not to take it. This was her opportunity, and Tammy had to believe in her heart that Wayne would approve. Dear Karl, I hope you don't find me too presumptuous for addressing you by your first name, but Mr. Gerber just feels a little too formal, given the nature of this letter. I want to assure you that I have never done anything like this in the past, and that I'll understand completely if I do not hear from you. I saw your advertisement, and can't say exactly why, but something about it appealed to me. Perhaps it's loneliness, a fear of being alone, or perhaps it's because I lost my husband not too long ago. Ever since I walked away from his grave, life and living have been hard, harder than usual. At first, I thought I'd manage, but existence becomes unbelievably precarious with only one income. I'm not telling you this in hopes of your sympathy, but merely so that you understand my reasons for checking through the paper in the first place. I loved my husband dearly, but I am young and can't imagine struggling through the rest of my life alone. I know that he would have wanted me to love again, to have children, and to secure a future filled with laughter. Although it feels a little like betrayal, I hope for the same. I am gentle, kind, hardworking, and satisfied with little. I don't need trinkets or fancy clothes, only a good pot of tea and a fire crackling in the hearth during winter. At the moment, there is little time for tea or fires, but one day I hope to have the time to enjoy them again. When I read your advertisement, I couldn't help but be impressed that you are a merchandiser. I can't imagine how clever and hardworking one must be to build a business from nothing. Personally, I'm a seamstress. Currently, I sew in a factory during the day, and I take in private sewing work in the evening as needed, which provides me with an extra income. I'm not sure if you'll write back, and please don't feel pressured if you can't imagine a future with me. But if you do, I look forward to hearing from you. Kindest regards, Tammy. Tammy folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. For a moment, she considered mailing it in the morning. Then she realized that if she had the chance to reconsider, she might never mail it at all. She grabbed her coat and the envelope, and under the cover of the night, she walked to the post office. She slipped it under the door with enough money to cover the postage, and then she headed home. That night, when she climbed into bed, Tammy left the whole matter in the hands of God. Whether or not the letter reached Karl Gerber, as well as whether or not he would write back, were now up to God. She had taken a leap of faith, and now she had to have faith in God's plan for her life. Chapter 4. Wrapped in 3 blankets, wearing her coat to bed, Tammy finally reached for the letter that had arrived earlier that day. Her fingers were so cold they could hardly handle the letter to get it open, her breath coming in white puffs as she tried to ignore the freezing weather. If she had thought 8 months ago that her life couldn't get any worse, she had been wrong. She had managed to scrape by and reach Christmas without losing the house, only to learn on Christmas Eve that the factory was closing down, and with it her means to earn an income. For the last week, she had tried to figure out what she was going to do for money. Since it didn't matter how many sewing jobs she took in, she couldn't manage to make ends meet. Her wood stove was as cold as the air outside, being that she was unable to afford wood. She had been unable to afford gas since before summer, and now her only source of heat in the cold Boston winter was her bed and her blankets. The money she had kept tucked away until April was spent, leaving her with more anxiety than ever before. Come January's end, Tammy had no way to pay the mortgage. She drew in a deep breath and glanced around by the dim light of a candle. She only had a month left in the home she had shared with Wayne, then she would be homeless. Tammy pushed the horrible thought away and reached for Karl's letter. Although she had never met Karl Gerber before, their correspondence over the last 8 months had become the highlight of her life. She looked forward to reading about the quaint Texas town in which he lived and all the customers that frequented his store. She couldn't say that she was falling in love, but she felt some sort of affection for the man who wrote lengthy letters and expressed concern for her well-being in every one of them. They had never spoken of marriage or their dreams for the future after those very first letters, but Tammy wouldn't lose hope. Instead, with every letter that arrived, she hoped that Karl would finally express his affection for her, giving her a little more courage to hang on a little longer. My dearest Tammy, I hope you have been well since my last letter. I know you mentioned that you would be spending Christmas on your own, but please know that I thought of you the whole day. Although it's winter, we've had lovely weather these last few weeks. Some days I even managed to open the store without wearing a coat. I can only imagine how cold it must be in Boston, especially after you mentioned the snowfall in your last letter. I write this letter having only celebrated Christmas yesterday, knowing that there is something I need to ask you. For the last 8 months, we've both been cautious with our feelings and our hopes, but I think the time for caution has passed. Tammy, I would be honored if you would agree to come to Texas and be my wife. I know we haven't met, but from our correspondence, I can only imagine us getting along just fine. It pains my heart to read how hard you work and how you suffer beneath the weight of the mortgage without any hope of support. I want to care for you, and I want to protect you from the cruelty this world has to offer. I know that you might be hesitant to open your heart to love again, as am I after losing my fiancé. But in my heart, I know that with time, we might find our affection for each other grow into love, the love that will bring us a family and carry us into a blessed future. I've enclosed in this letter enough money for your train fare as well as essentials, with enough to spare if you need it along the way. I know this might come as a shock to you, but I'm eagerly looking forward to your arrival. Don't take time to consider, Tammy. Rather, send me a wire informing me of the date on which I should expect your arrival. I promise to cherish, care, protect, and provide for you. Fondest regards, Karl. Tammy hadn't realized that tears were streaming down her face until she finished reading the letter. She hadn't lied to Karl about her past or her marriage to Wayne. She had expected this was the reason behind his hesitation to express his feelings. To know that he cared and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her was very uplifting. Although it was late at night, Tammy shoved back the blankets and climbed out of bed. She went in search of the large steam trunk which she retrieved from the corner of the spare bedroom. Everything that she could sell, she had sold over the last few months to make ends meet, so there wasn't much left in the house. As the clock struck 12, Tammy began to pack. The train journey south would take at least a few days. She could sleep then, she reasoned. Right now, it was time for her to pack up her life and her memories. When the sun peeked over the horizon, she would say goodbye to her life with Wayne and her time in Boston and head to the train station. Before night fell, she would be on her way to Karl and a life free of Boston's treacherously cold weather and the poverty she had suffered since Wayne's death. With a skip in her step, she began to pack, thanking God for his mercy and kindness the entire time. She was about to start a new chapter, and although she wasn't sure what that chapter would bring, she knew it would be better than the one on which she was finally turning the page. Chapter 5. Oh, my Michael, would you look at that? It must be one of them famous Pullman trains we read about back home. Tammy turned to the passengers on the other side of the aisle, intrigued by the conversation. She followed their gazes and couldn't stop her eyes from widening at what had to be the ultimate lap of luxury. Yes, it is. It's a shame we're not going to Omaha. I might have just taken you on a Pullman train instead. the man said with humor in his voice. The woman playfully patted his arm. Don't be daft. I heard a ticket in one of the palace cars cost about 10 times what we paid for our ticket. But then we would have had a dining cart and a sleeper cabin, and we would even have been able to relax in the lounge, the man countered with a patient smile. Instead, we're going to sit here, feel our rears go numb over the next couple of days, and nap on each other's shoulders as if we were apes in the jungle. The woman let out a heavy sigh. I really hope Sanderson is all you said it would be. Tammy's ears were now fully honed in on the conversation on the other side of the aisle. They might be in New York, and the sights outside the cabin window might be intriguing, but the conversation beside her intrigued her much more. She had boarded the train the morning before, and shortly afterwards, the man and the woman beside her had boarded as well. They seemed like a nice middle-aged couple, and it warmed Tammy's heart to see how the man always made sure that his wife was comfortable. It is, and without a pastor, Janet, you'll take great care to remember that. You married a man of the clergy, and that means we go where God needs us. The man smiled gently. I know, but I was just getting used to Boston. She let out a quiet sigh. I am looking forward to the warmer weather. It's been downright chilly here these last few months. Excuse me? Tammy said, leaning into the aisle. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it's hard not to. Tammy glanced at the small aisle that separated them and the rows of passengers in front of and behind them. Are you going to Sanderson in Texas? The man glanced at his wife before he nodded. That's right, yes. Michael is going to be the new pastor. He received his posting a few days ago. Seems as if the old pastor suffered a terrible fever before he passed, the woman explained eagerly before she leaned over her husband. I'm Janet Finley, and this is my husband, Michael. Tammy accepted the friendly introduction with a smile. I'm Tammy White. I'm heading to Sanderson myself. Well, isn't that wonderful? At least I know I'll have a friend by the time we get there. Janet laughed. That's the only thing about Michael's profession. We tend to move more than is normal. This is the last time, Michael said evenly before he turned to Tammy. It's a pleasure to meet you, Tammy. What my wife meant was that over the last few years, I've always done missionary work, temporary postings and such. Sanderson is my first permanent posting. He reached for his wife's hand and smiled. It's where we'll build a home and raise our family. Tammy's heart warmed at the love that was clear to see in their eyes. She remembered how wonderful it felt to look at someone and feel accepted, cherished, and loved all at the same time. You must be excited then. Oh, of course. It's just a long ride before we get there. Janet sighed, shifting in her seat again, in an attempt to make herself more comfortable. How about you, Miss White? What is your business in Sanderson? It is not often that a woman travels cross-country by herself. Are your parents there? Michael asked kindly. Tammy couldn't help but laugh. Although she was 25 years old, people often mistook her for a teenager. Her laughter quickly faded when she realized that she had to tell these respectable people her reason for heading to Texas alone. They would invariably find out when the train left them all together in the same town. I'm going to Sanderson to marry the merchandiser. Is that right? That means my first order of business will be a wedding then. How pleasant. Michael said, getting up. I'm going to stretch my legs while you two ladies get better acquainted. Janet smiled indulgently when he left. Michael has a hard time when he can't move about freely. He's always moving about, whether he's giving a sermon or drinking a cup of tea on the porch. So tell me about your soon-to-be husband. Tammy looked from side to side to make sure no one was listening before she slipped across the aisle and took a seat beside Janet. Actually, I haven't met him just yet. What? Janet asked with open shock. Tammy nodded before she continued to explain about the matrimonial times and their correspondence. After a while, she noticed Michael return and take her seat, allowing her and Janet to continue talking. By the time she had explained everything from the day Wayne rescued her from her parents right down to climbing on the train, Janet had tenderly wrapped both her hands over Tammy's. You're a brave girl, Tammy, braver than any I think I've ever met. And you're right. God has plans for our future, and I hope that you're blessed, loved, and happy in Sanderson. Tammy smiled hopefully. I hope so. Since boarding the train, I've been wondering if Karl Gerber is who he portrayed in the letters. What if he's an old man actually just looking for a slave, someone to work for him without needing to be paid? She chuckled, shaking her head. My imagination's running rampant, I'm afraid. Perhaps he is, but, my dear, unless he's mean, I still think it's a better opportunity for you than staying in Boston. Going through an entire winter without heat or a fire in the hearth, I can't even imagine how hard it must have been. It was hard, at times. Tammy admitted quietly. With Michael being a pastor and all, I was afraid you wouldn't approve. Janet laughed and glanced across the aisle at her husband. The Bible tells us not to judge, but to love our neighbors. Besides, I'm hardly one to talk. When Michael asked my parents for my hand, they refused, saying that he would never be able to provide for me. We ran away together. This time it was Tammy who laughed. Looking at the respectable couple, she would never have imagined Janet doing something so rebellious. It looks like you don't regret it? Not at all. Michael is mine and I am his. I'm sure you felt the same way with Wayne. Without Michael, I'm afraid I wouldn't know what to do at all. In time, I hope you find that same love connection with your merchandiser, Janet added. Tammy nodded. I hope so, too. They talked for almost another 2 hours before Tammy and Michael traded places again. Tammy now looked even more forward to living in Sanderson. Not only would she not be cold, she already had a friend in Janet. Chapter 6. I know they said that Sanderson was a small town. I didn't realize that meant a dozen houses and a thoroughfare, Pastor Michael exclaimed as they disembarked from the train. Tammy stood beside the pastor and his wife and glanced around the small town. There wasn't a single person in sight, and the ticket office was barely more than a small hut. The platform was brand new with the hope of all the business the railway would bring to Sanderson, but right now Tammy didn't feel hope at all. She had sent a wire to Karl to inform him of her expected time of arrival, but he did not appear to be there to meet her. It seemed they were at the edge of town as the first buildings only began a few hundred yards away. Even glancing down the thoroughfare, not a single soul was to be seen. It was as if the train had stopped in a ghost town. Tammy jolted when the trains whistled by way of announcing its departure. They turned to see that the conductor had left their bags at the edge of the platform while the train was slowly making its way out of the town that consisted of nothing but dust and abandoned streets. Do you know where we should go? Janet asked with some concern as she turned to her husband. The pastor shrugged before he pointed to a church tower at the end of the thoroughfare. I'd say the church is a good place to start. This doesn't feel right, Tammy said almost to herself. It's as if the town was built and then simply abandoned. Is someone coming to meet you, Miss White? The pastor asked. Although they had become well acquainted over the last couple of days, he still insisted on calling her Miss White. So in turn, Tammy insisted on calling him Pastor Michael. Yes, Karl Gerber. He said he would be on the platform to meet me, Tammy said, shaking her head. From the train platform, she couldn't even see a merchandising store. An eerie feeling ran down her spine as she turned to Janet with fear in her heart. Something's wrong. Janet shook her head with a hopeful smile, the faith that only a pastor's wife could have shining her eyes. I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding. We'll wait with you, won't we, Michael? Michael nodded. Of course, although I think we might have a better chance of finding people if we head towards town. What about our luggage? Tammy asked, glancing at her steam trunk and carpet bag. It was nothing compared to the suitcases, hat cases, and trunks in the Finleys' possession. I'm sure they'll be just dandy if we leave them right where they are. Besides, who's going to snatch them? The pastor asked with a shrug. Tammy nodded and followed Michael and Janet off the platform and in the direction of the dirt road that led into town. She had seen most of the country over the last few days, but she had never in all her life seen quite so much dust. It was as if it was roused with every step, and she could almost taste it on her tongue. When they reached the first building, Michael stepped closer and peered inside, announcing before long that it looked like a barber shop. Every building they happened upon, right down to even the sheriff's office, was empty. The further they wandered into the ghost town, the more Tammy became anxious that her coming here had been a mistake that was now too far in to rectify. "When will the train be coming through Sanderson again?" Tammy asked, voicing her fears. "Oh, hush. You're going to live right here in Sanderson. We'll find out where everyone is soon enough," Janet said playfully. Tammy wished she had Janet's faith at that moment, whereas all she could think of was where she was going to spend the night and what she was going to eat. Her worry was that even if the train did return, she would not have enough money to buy a ticket to return to Boston. "The church is barely a year old," Michael said with admiration as they came upon it to view it in full. "They built it along with the train platform. Apparently the town accepted the railway coming through Sanderson in exchange for a church." "It's lovely, Michael." Janet smiled at her husband and reached for his hand. "The merchandise store." Tammy cried out and rushed across the street to the general store that was owned by Karl Gerber. She opened the door and took a look around, hoping to lay eyes on her betrothed for the first time. To her dismay, however, just like the rest of town, there was nothing inside but silence and dust. "He's not here." "Michael, I think Tammy's right. Something is wrong. Where are all the people?" Janet asked, voicing doubt for the very first time. "God won't lead us here only to abandon us, Janet. Come on, let's keep going," Michael said firmly, but Tammy could hear he was beginning to doubt his own words as well. Tammy glanced back at the merchandise store and the house beside it. It was a lovely building, and although the town wasn't large, she could imagine herself being very happy there. That was provided she could ever find Karl Gerber. A sigh escaped her as they kept on walking with nothing but the church steeple to guide them. They passed a seamstress, a dress shop, a diner, and even the mayor's office, and still there was no sign of a single person. Tammy couldn't help but remember something in the Bible about the plague, and for a moment wondered if a plague had taken all the lives in this town. She shook her head, willing her imagination to stop. Hysteria wasn't going to be of any help now. Michael was right. They just had to keep looking. Chapter 7. "There," Michael called out as they crossed a side street. He pointed down the street even as he sighed with relief. They must be there. Tammy and Janet followed his gaze and saw movement in front of what looked like the surgery. There was no sign of any sort, just a cross painted against the side of the house. Eager to confirm the town was inhabited after all, the trio of new arrivals rushed in the direction of the movement at a hastened pace. "I think it's the surgery, or at least I hope that is what the cross indicates," Janet said as they approached. Two men were standing outside with no one else anywhere to be seen. Tammy followed Janet and Michael, hoping that Michael's new position as the pastor would ensure that the townsfolk would be welcoming. They stopped a few yards short, and Michael cleared his throat. "Good afternoon. I wonder if you could perhaps help." The men turned, and Tammy's breath caught. She didn't even notice the second man because the first man was the spitting image of the man she had dreamed about that night back in Boston. He wore a wide-brim hat that shielded his face against the sun, but Tammy felt sure that she recognized him. His eyes were green, almost the color of a pond in spring. His hair was a dusty blonde, and she couldn't help but wonder if it would glitter like gold if the sun caught it. Tanned skin made his complexion even more appealing in the late afternoon light. Tammy frowned, feeling lightheaded as the man turned to Michael. "Howdy, ain't seen you round these parts before. How can we be of assistance?" The man glanced around as if searching for their wagon or horses. As if reading his mind, Michael answered, "We just arrived on the afternoon train. I am Pastor Michael Finley, and this here is my wife, Janet. We were told we'd be welcomed by the mayor on our arrival." "Oh, shoot. Peter probably forgot all about your arrival as a result of the town naming celebrations," the man said, shaking his head before he chuckled. "Not ours, as you can see. A town about a few miles west is celebrating its first town naming parade. As you can see, almost all of the people that call this town home have left to celebrate with them." He held out his hand to Michael. "I'm Jake Stoddart, the town doctor. Welcome to Sanderson." "That explains why there is no one in town," Janet said with a relieved smile. Yes, it does. Just me and old Jimmy that stayed behind. This here is Jimmy Parker, blacksmith, stable owner, who is generally not fond of crowds. Jake held his hand to one side of his mouth as if telling a secret, or fireworks. Ah, Doc, you didn't need to go and tell the new pastor about my fears, Jimmy admonished the doctor with a shake of his head. I think I know where you folks will be staying. If you give me a moment, I'll take you there, Jake said kindly. Jimmy, would you mind taking a wagon and fetching the pastor and his family's luggage from the platform? Sure thing, Doc, Jimmy said before he turned on his heel and walked away in the direction the trio had just come. For the duration of the conversation, Tammy hadn't said a single word. She had held back, trying to wonder why she dreamed of the town doctor. She tried to remember the dream, and the more she thought about it, the more she was certain that Jake was the man in her dreams. It didn't make any sense at all. Oh, I'm sorry. Where are my manners? Dr. Stoddart, this here is Tammy White, Michael introduced her. Please, it's Jake or Doc. Don't bother with the Stoddart. No one else does, Jake said to Michael before turning to Tammy. Good day, Miss White, Tammy smiled nervously. Good day, Doctor. In prosody. Although we traveled together, I'm not with the pastor and his wife. Karl Gerber was supposed to meet me on the platform on my arrival. Did he go to the town naming celebration as well? Tammy asked hopefully. The doctor paled noticeably and his brows drew together. Karl Gerber, who owns the merchandise store. Yes? Tammy nodded hesitantly. I'm so sorry, miss, but I don't know how to tell you this, so I'll just come right out and say it. This morning, while he was loading up some supplies for the men to take to the celebration, his horse got spooked. Jake sighed heavily and glanced at Michael and Janet before returning his gaze to Tammy. He was severely injured, Miss White. Tammy's breath came in shallow pants at the shock of his revelation. She had just come all this way to marry a man who was now severely ill. She gathered her courage and took a deep breath. I don't mind taking care of him. He'll recover soon under your medical care. I'm not sure I'm explaining this correctly, the doctor said softly, stepping closer to Tammy. He was run over by a wagon heavily laden with merchandise. He has a broken leg, extensive internal bruising of his abdomen, and I'm afraid I suspect a collapsed lung as well. I'm doing all I can, but I'm afraid I don't think he'll make it through the night. Tammy listened to his words and imagined the injuries, and all that came to mind was a broken man. Another funeral, another loss. Her vision started to blur at the corners, darkness clouding out the light as she felt her mind begin to spin. It might have been the fact that she hadn't eaten, the heat, or simply the shock of learning of Karl's fate. A million thoughts ran through her mind. Concern for Karl's injuries at the forefront, but at the back of her mind, all she could think of was that she had just traveled thousands of miles to be widowed, even before she could be wed. Before she could ask to see Karl, she felt her consciousness fade into darkness. It was as if she was falling and falling without being controlled until her world was enveloped in black. Chapter 8. Oh my gosh, is she all right? Janet's voice sounded far off in the distance, too far for Tammy to comprehend fully. She heard the men mutter, but she couldn't find the strength to open her eyes. She felt as if she was suspended in air with a warm cloud to rest against. Tammy, can you hear me? The doctor's voice asked quietly, the proximity close. Tammy's eyes fluttered open only to find Jake's face only inches from hers. What happened? You fainted, Janet said, rushing closer. 1 minute you were fine, and the next second, luckily Doc here is quick on his feet, caught you before you could hit the ground. Only then did Tammy realize she was in the doctor's arms. Her face flushed red. How foolish of me. You can put me down now, Tammy said, glancing at him. Gently, Jake set her back on her feet, but not without keeping a hand on her upper arm. There, are you steady on your feet? He searched her eyes, making sure she was all right. Just breathe through it. Tammy nodded and took a few shallow breaths before Jake smiled kindly. Deep, slow breaths. How are you feeling now? Better? I think so, Tammy said, drawing in a deep breath before she remembered the words that were spoken before she fainted. Karl? Tammy shook her head. You said his injuries are severe? Jake nodded, with an apology in his eyes. I've done everything I could, but the injuries. Sometimes the only thing you can do is to make a patient comfortable for the inevitable end. I'm so sorry. I wish I could have done more. Tammy nodded. It was an accident. It's not your fault. No, it ain't my fault, but as the town doc, I wish I could do more, Jake admitted. Tammy understood. Can you take me to him, please? Of course, Jake said, glancing at the Finleys. He's in the surgery. Tammy allowed herself to be led into the surgery. It smelled like medicine and coffee. There were books stacked all over, along with a few medical instruments she didn't recognize. Jake led her through what seemed to be the front room into a side room off the back. There were 2 beds against one wall, and on the one bed lay a man that was clearly in a lot of pain. Although he didn't make a sound, she could see it in his drawn and pale face. He had a sheet covering him and blood already seeping through, creating dark red stains. Tammy ignored the stains and moved closer. Karl? I've given him laudanum for the pain, to ease it, but it's not working as well as I would have hoped, Jake explained as he let go of Tammy's arm. I think he can hear you. Tammy wasn't feeling faint now as she rushed towards the bed and reached for the bruised and bloodied hand that lay at Karl's side. His breaths were coming in rasps, his chest heaving with the effort. Tammy didn't have to see the injuries to know that this man was fighting for his life. She said a quick prayer for strength as she searched his face. He looked like a kind man, like the man he said he would be. Karl, it's Tammy, Tammy said quietly, biting back the tears. He was handsome, and something about his face made him appear kind. Tammy couldn't help but wish she had met him before the accident. He groaned before his eyes fluttered open. Tammy, you came. You actually came. Of course I came. I told you I would. It's such a pleasure to finally meet you. Tammy's voice was breaking with emotion as she wondered at the type of life they might have shared. Pleasure is all mine, Karl greeted weakly before he coughed. Tammy quickly reached for her handkerchief and offered it. He covered his mouth, but when he pulled his hand back, the handkerchief was spotted with blood. He drew in a breath, but she could see the desperation in his eyes. There was nothing left for him in this world. He was fighting to hold on, but it was clear his body was failing him. He offered her a weak smile. She could tell how hard it was through the pain. His eyes fluttered closed, and she felt him squeeze her hand as if apologizing for his condition. Tammy wished she had come sooner. She wished things were different. But most of all, she prayed that a miracle would heal Karl and allow them the life they had spoken of in their letters. Beside her, she heard Jake's voice as he quietly spoke. It won't be long now. Tammy wanted to shout at him for not having faith, but she knew it would be foolish. Karl was suffering, and not even the laudanum that Jake had administered could ease the pain. He was broken and deserved to be set free from the pain. She didn't move. Instead, she held onto his hand and began to speak. Her voice was soft, as if she was afraid of startling or exciting him. The first time you wrote to me, I was certain it would be the last time. Your letters, they were the only thing that gave me hope over these last months. You told me so much about Sanderson and the store that I could imagine them in my mind's eye. You described them exactly as they are. Tammy quickly brushed a tear from her cheek, not because she had a deep emotional connection with the man fighting for his life on the bed, but because she was human. You were my hope, Karl. The life you spoke of for our future was my dream, too. I'm so happy I made it in time to meet you. I will never forget you. When Karl's breath escaped in a ragged puff, Tammy didn't need a doctor to tell her that he was gone. She felt his hand go limp in hers even as his chest stilled. She didn't let go. She sat by his side and prayed that God would guide him safely to the gates of heaven. After a while, she felt Jake rest his hand on her shoulder. He's gone. Tammy stood up and felt her head spin. She needed fresh air. She needed to get away from the smell of medicine and blood. She moved through the surgery without waiting for Jake to lead her until she stood outside on the street. Furiously, she brushed away the tears that were streaming down her face, and she fought for composure. She sank onto her haunches, wondering what she was going to do now. She had no money left, and even if she did go back to Boston, she had no place to live, and she had no job. Her situation in Sanderson had just turned into the very nightmare from which she had fled. "Are you all right?" Jake asked as he joined her outside. Tammy nodded and sniffed back the tears. "Don't really have a choice now, do I?" Karl mentioned he had a mail-order bride coming. "I thought he was kidding," Jake said almost to himself. Tammy looked up at him with a narrowed expression. "I'm here, ain't I?" "Yeah, of course. Look, I can't just leave you out here on the street. The pastor and the wife said I should take you to them after." Tammy wanted to argue, but she really had no choice. She only knew 2 people in this town, and right now she needed a friend. She straightened and met Jake's gaze. "Yes, I think I'll go there. Could you tell me where it is?" Jake glanced back at the surgery before meeting her gaze. "I'll walk with you." Tammy knew he had to deal with Karl, so she simply shook her head. "I'm sure I'll find it if you point me in the right direction." A short while later, Tammy knocked on the door of a quaint wooden cabin. It had a porch that would allow one to sit and watch the sunset and large windows to let in the light. She had barely knocked when Janet opened the door. Her eyes were widened with sympathy when she said, "Oh, you poor dear. Come in. I've got tea on the wood stove." Following Janet into the house, Tammy couldn't help but be surprised at how quickly the pastor and his wife had settled in. They had tea on the stove along with some sort of stew. The pastor was sitting on a couch with the Bible and a notebook close by. Although there were no curtains or personal items displayed, Tammy could already feel that this was their home. It offered the same type of calm and peace that Michael and Janet exuded. Tammy took a seat at the kitchen table and let out a heavy sigh. "He's passed." "I'm sorry to hear that, Tammy. I know how much you looked forward to meeting him," Janet sympathized as she placed a cup of tea before Tammy. "Bless the mayor, we found fresh meat and a few pantry items already in place for our arrival. I've got a stew going if you'd like to stay." Michael joined them at that moment. "Of course she's going to stay," Tammy sighed. "It's not like I have anywhere else to go. I still have to pray that the boarding house will let me work for a room for the night." "Nonsense," Janet said firmly. "You'll stay here, right, Michael?" "I don't want to impose. You're being too kind already." Tammy was quick to reject the offer. "We have 2 bedrooms, and it makes no sense for you to struggle for a room if there is one right here for you," Janet insisted. "Not just for the night, but until you're back on your feet," Michael added. "From what I understand, without Karl, you don't really have a place to stay or a means to provide for yourself. We'll be happy to help you." Tammy wanted to refuse their kindness. These were her friends, and she didn't want to accept their charity, but did she really have a choice? She thought for a moment before she finally agreed. "Thank you. I truly appreciate your hospitality, but I won't be staying for free. I'd like to do the housework in return for my room and board." Prosody rate. "I'll be happy to help with cleaning the church after services as well." Janet laughed. "She's not an easy one to help now, is she, Michael?" Michael chuckled. "No, she isn't. It won't be necessary, but if it will make you feel better, that would be wonderful." Tammy nodded. "I insist." "Then it's settled. Come, let me show you to your room. There are blankets and sheets in one of our trunks. You can help me unpack them later." Janet said as she led Tammy to the spare bedroom. Tammy stepped inside and couldn't help but feel grateful for the sun shining through the window and basking the room in light. "It's a beautiful room." "They both are," Janet agreed. "Sanderson might look like a ghost town at the moment, but it already feels like home." The word home caught Tammy off guard. She turned to Janet with tears in her eyes. "I was supposed to have a home, a husband, and a new life when I arrived. What am I going to do, Janet?" "You poor dear," Janet said, embracing Tammy. "We'll pray. Remember that God has a plan for your life, although it doesn't always feel that way." Tammy stepped back and smiled through her tears. "He sure has a way of leading me around the bush. I just wish he would reveal the plan to me." "In his time," Janet said with a gentle smile. "All good things come in his time." "I wish I had your faith," Tammy admitted. "I used to until Wayne. It just feels like I've been running into walls ever since, stumbling over my own feet." "Then perhaps it's time you stop running. Just like you're already thinking about how you're going to find another place to stay. Michael and I would love to have you. So take the time to recover from all your running and be patient. God won't let his children be forgotten. Just like he brought Michael and me here to speak his gospel in this town, he brought you here for a reason. Besides, I wouldn't have had a friend in town were it not for you. Tammy smiled, hoping that Janet was right. She was already thinking of a way to find other accommodations, but perhaps it was time to stop running, time to stop thinking about her future. It was time for her to be patient and to accept that God did have a plan, even if it didn't feel like it right now. You know, Janet, you're right. God brought us together so that I would have a friend when Karl passed as well. He does have a plan. I won't try to find other accommodations, but I will do my best to help around the house. Wonderful. I'll ask Michael to send word for your luggage. Why don't you come and have another cup of tea? Janet smiled. Tammy paused and searched Janet's gaze. Why are you being so nice to me? I'm not your problem. Janet shook her head. Of course, you're not my problem, and that's the very reason we'd like to help you. Come on, the tea is getting cold. Tammy followed Janet into the small kitchen and took a seat at the table. This time she didn't pray for a way out, but she prayed for God to bless the Finleys. Chapter 10. Tammy pulled the black shawl over her shoulders as she looked out the window. It might be winter, but in Sanderson there wasn't a single snowflake. Instead, only dust and a cold wind that could slice right through you. Tammy, are you ready? Michael is getting the wagon, Janet said after briefly knocking on the door. Tammy drew in a deep breath. Would she ever be ready to stand beside the grave of another man? Although she didn't have the feelings for Karl that she had for Wayne, she did have the dreams of a future that she had to say goodbye to today, along with the man she had traveled here to be with. I'm coming, Tammy said, grabbing her satchel. She stepped out and saw the sympathy in Janet's eyes. Janet understood that Tammy wasn't quite prepared to handle the funeral. I'll be right there with you, Janet said, slipping her hand through Tammy's elbow. They walked outside just as Michael brought the wagon that the town had gifted him around the corner. Tammy glanced at Janet with a questioning look. Is Michael all right? I'm sure he didn't think his first act as pastor of Sanderson was going to be to lead a funeral. Michael is just fine. This is what he does. It's a privilege for him to speak a blessing over someone that is now at the side of the Lord, Janet said, before she smiled at Tammy. A short while later, they arrived at the small cemetery at the other edge of the town. There were a few crosses planted in the earth, giving Tammy a clear idea of how many people had drawn their last breaths in Sanderson. Mrs. Finley, Miss White, Jake greeted them as they climbed out of the buggy. Tammy turned to him with a smile. It's just Tammy, please. In that case, it's just Jake, he said with a friendly smile before his eyes narrowed. I'm sorry for your loss. I only realized yesterday how I never offered my condolences. Tammy nodded gratefully. The day before, with everyone back from the naming ceremony of the neighboring town, numerous people had stopped by the new pastorage to introduce themselves and at the same time to offer Tammy their condolences. She couldn't help but feel like a fraud. She had never married Karl Gerber, and although they had corresponded with each other for more than 8 months, she had only known him for a few minutes. She followed Janet to the grave that a few of Karl's friends had dug the day before. Beside the grave was the wagon that held the coffin. The sight of it brought back so many memories of Wayne's funeral. She swallowed past the lump in her throat before she took her place at the grave. If she had to count, Tammy would have guessed the whole town had turned out to see Karl laid to rest. What had seemed like a ghost town on the day of their arrival was clearly a growing town with a growing population. Children, some as young as only a few months old and others venturing into the years before adulthood, stood with their parents. Every now and then, she would notice their curious glances in her direction, but Tammy didn't mind. She understood their curiosity. Who was this woman Karl Gerber had asked to marry him without even meeting her? For the first time, Tammy saw Michael in his position as pastor. His words were kind and gently ebbed and flowed to hold the community's attention. Although he had never known Karl personally, he spoke with such kindness about him. He talked about the wonders of heaven and how Karl was now free of pain and worldly sins. By the time the men lowered the coffin into the ground, Tammy was grateful it was almost over. Emotions were swimming in her mind, making her feel slightly lightheaded, and the last thing she wanted was to faint in full view of the whole town. In Stiswostri 7%. Michael said his last blessing before the gathering of the community broke apart to go their separate ways. Tammy stayed where she stood for a moment, offering her own prayers for Karl. When she turned to meet Michael and Janet at their wagon, she saw a man talking to them. She headed in their direction, assuming him to be just another member of the community, eager to meet the new pastor. "Tammy, there you are." Mr. Scott asked if he might follow us home. "He says there are things he needs to discuss with you," Janet explained, even as she made the introductions. "Of course," Tammy said, wondering what the sophisticated man could possibly have to discuss with her. The trip back to their home felt longer than before, possibly because Tammy could feel Mr. Scott's eyes on her back the entire time. When they arrived, Janet quickly set about putting on a pot of tea while Michael and Mr. Scott sat in the front room making small talk. Tammy didn't say a word, knowing that Mr. Scott would say what he needed to say when he was ready. Janet returned with a tray of tea and a smile. "Here we are." Once everyone had a cup of tea, Mr. Scott turned to Tammy. "I've learned not to listen to the town gossip, so I just want to confirm that you are Tamara White of Boston, Massachusetts." "Yes, I am," Tammy said carefully. "I'm sorry, what is this about?" "I'll explain in a moment. Do you perhaps have the letters that Mr. Gerber wrote to you?" "I won't read them or keep them. I just need to see his signature," Mr. Scott asked. Tammy felt a little unsure behind this man wanting access to her letters, but she went to fetch them. She had tied them together with string, which she carefully untied before she handed him a single letter. "I see. There it is. Karl Gerber." Mr. Scott smiled brightly and pulled a sheet of paper out of his jacket. "Mr. Gerber was nothing if not prepared, Miss White. He came to me the day before his accident to draw up a new will. He wanted to make sure that his affairs were in order before the wedding." He handed the piece of paper to Tammy, and she frowned as she unfolded it. She read it quietly, wondering if her eyes were imagining things before she turned to Mr. Scott. "Is this legal? Is this valid?" Mr. Scott nodded. "Yup, as legal as any other document that comes through my office." Harvard Law graduate. "Tammy, what does it say?" Janet asked, clearly not as patient as her husband to find out about the contents of Karl's will as it pertained to Tamara White of Boston, Massachusetts. Tammy was at a loss for words as she read the letter again. "It says that Mr. Gerber's will states that Miss White inherits the mercantile store, the adjacent home, all existing stock, and the money in his accounts at the bank. I won't say Miss White is a wealthy woman, but she does have a running business concern and a home." Tammy felt a smile curve her mouth. "I own the mercantile store and a home?" Her brows quickly furrowed. "Mortgage?" she quickly asked. She'd been down this road before. "No mortgage. Mr. Gerber always insisted on buying using cash instead of credit. He built the store over a period of 2 years to its current size, adding on as was needed and as he had the funds to do so. He was one of the first men to settle in Sanderson." "Tammy, this is wonderful," Janet said, clapping her hands. Tammy couldn't stop the smile broaden on her face. "It is. It truly is." She held the will against her chest before she smiled up at the roof. "Thank you, Karl." Chapter 11. Tammy had just finished drying the breakfast dishes when there was a knock on the door. Janet and Michael had gone to church to take a look at what was available and what he would need for sermons from the house. She set down the drying cloth and headed to the door, knowing it was just another eager member of the congregation calling around to meet Michael. She would simply tell them to head over to the church, and then she would finish packing before dragging her things down Main Street to her new home. "Jake?" Tammy greeted with surprise as she opened the door. "Are you looking for Michael? I mean, Pastor Michael." Since she had agreed to live with them, Michael had insisted she address him by his first name. "Nope, I found exactly who I was looking for," Jake said with a smile, his green eyes sparkling in the morning light. Tammy's heart skipped a beat as a hesitant smile curved the corners of her mouth. And why would that be? I thought you might need some help getting your things down to the mercantile, Jake explained. At Tammy's surprised look, he chuckled. It's a small town. Word travels fast. She let out a sigh of relief. I should have thought. Actually, I'm finished packing. I was just finishing up with the dishes before I planned to drag my things down the thoroughfare. Jake laughed. No need for dragging. I'll wait out here until you're done, and then I'll help. Tammy was charmed by his kindness. I am done, actually. I'll go fetch the steam trunk for you. The carpet bag I can handle by myself. I'll come in to get it myself. Mabel is very excited to meet you. Mr. Scott stopped by the mercantile yesterday to reassure her that she's still employed. Oh, that might have been a little presumptuous of him. Isn't it up to you if she's still employed? Jake rambled as he picked up the steam trunk and carried it outside as if it weighed nothing at all. Jake, who is Mabel? Tammy asked with clear confusion as she followed him down the porch and onto the dirt road of the thoroughfare. His laughter floated on the breeze. She's the shop assistant at the mercantile. She's been working for Karl since he opened the store. Of course she's employed then. I'm going to need someone to show me how everything works. Tammy stopped for a moment and shook her head. Jake, how am I going to manage a store? I've never managed anything in my life. Jake turned to her with a confident smile. According to the gossip, you've buried a husband, traveled across the country only to bury Karl. I'd say you've managed quite well. You'll be fine. His confidence in her made her feel hopeful that he was right. They were quiet for the rest of the way. When they reached the mercantile store, Tammy stopped and looked at the building. It was well kept and larger than she remembered. The house adjacent to it looked very similar to the one in which the Finleys lived. Her heart swelled in her chest. This wasn't just a house and a shop. It was her future, and she finally had her very own home, no strings attached. A tear spilled over her cheek. I'll be forever grateful, Karl. Jake only smiled as if he knew now wasn't the time for questions. He waited until Tammy was ready before he led the way to the house. As soon as Tammy stepped into her home for the first time, the scent of lavender made her smile. He ordered it especially for your arrival, Jake explained, setting down the trunk. He was very excited to meet you. Although the lavender flowers had dried, Tammy knew they would hold their scent for a while yet. She also knew that for as long as she lived, she would remember the scent of lavender as the aroma of freedom. Oh, hello, a small voice said from the door. When Tammy turned to see who had spoken, she was surprised to find that the speaker was not so small. Without introduction, she knew the woman with the sturdy frame, round face, and more gray than black hair would be Mabel. Hello, you must be Mabel. I'm Tammy White, Tammy introduced herself, moving towards her. Mabel's face flushed with pleasure. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Karl couldn't stop talking about you over the last few weeks. I know you would have brought him only happiness. Thank you, Mabel. That's a very kind thing to say. Tammy smiled gratefully. Mabel didn't hold judgment in her gaze, but instead something close to admiration. I can come and settle in later. Why don't you show me the mercantile store? Of course, of course. I'm sure you're eager to see your new business. I just want to thank you for keeping me on. I wasn't sure if you would, Mabel admitted quietly. Tammy laughed. Why wouldn't I? I know nothing about the store, and apparently you've been Karl's trusted helper since the very beginning. Well, you've been meeting the right people, that's for sure, Mabel said, smiling at Jake. I've got to get back to the surgery, but you're in good hands with Mabel. Jake smiled at Tammy. Thank you for your trouble, Jake, Tammy said. Jake left the two women alone, and Mabel began to chuckle. Jake, is it? We all call him Doc. Is it wrong? Tammy asked, not wanting to make a bad impression on the townfolk. Not at all, Mabel assured her. He's a good man, and it's nice to see him befriending you. Spends most of his time at the surgery. He and Karl used to be good friends. Tammy nodded. I see. She felt a little awkward about the conversation, since she felt that Mabel was urging her to get better acquainted with Jake when she had only buried Karl the day before. She glanced out the window at Jake's frame growing smaller as he walked further away. She wondered if in time they could actually get better acquainted. She hadn't married Karl, but although they hadn't shared a life, they had made a commitment. Right now, her only commitment should be to the mercantile store. Chapter 12. Seems like you were born to be a shop owner, Jake said, glancing over his shoulder at the numerous people in the store. Tammy blushed and shook her head. It's Mabel. She's really been a sweetheart. I don't think there is a thing she doesn't know. Every time I wonder which supplier to send an order to, she's right there helping me with the correct details from whom to order. That's Mabel for you. She settled in town shortly after Karl and I. Arrived in town parched and sunburnt after walking for days. Her husband passed away on the Oregon Trail, and she kept heading south until she found a wagon willing to give her a ride. The wagon was robbed by highwaymen, but Mabel managed to escape. That's when she found Sanderson, and she's been here ever since. A chip off the old block, then? Tammy said with admiration in her voice as she watched Mabel help a customer to measure out flour. Is that all for you today? Jake glanced down at the sugar, boiled sweets, and chocolates that had only just arrived in the store the day before. Not a healthy diet, I know, he chuckled self-consciously. One day, perhaps, I might find a wife who will be willing to cook for me. Their eyes met, and not for the first time, Tammy wondered why the air seemed to grow thick. Over the last 2 months, she had settled into Sanderson and into her role as its store owner. The people were friendly and welcoming, and the church services led by Michael were rejuvenating. But every time she saw Jake, she felt as if she was thrown a little off balance. Tammy wasn't sure if it was because of the dream that kept coming to mind, or what the reason could be. But in a strange way, she enjoyed the feeling. Perhaps, Tammy said with a shy smile as she totaled his purchases. Jake gave her the money and winked at her. Good luck. It seems everyone is going to spend their weekly wages in one day, Tammy laughed. It's like this every Friday. Mabel and I have started keeping the store open later to give everyone a chance to stop by after getting their wages. The railroad company has truly brought a lot of work to Sanderson, Jake smiled. Good afternoon to you, Tammy. To you too, Tammy said before Jake turned and left the shop. More people arrived, and Tammy all too soon became too busy to even think about Jake or the unlikely friendship that had blossomed between them. Mabel was moving between the shoppers, helping them to find what they needed, while Tammy rang up item after item. It was a good day for the store, better than most, she thought. She reached for the next customer's purchases and began adding up the total. When she looked up to tell the customer what he owed, it was to find that she was looking right down a barrel of fun. You don't say nuttin' now, or your friend back there gets hurt, the man snarled with an evil grin. Tammy's eyes flew to the back of the store, where another man was holding Mabel at gunpoint. Please don't hurt her. I'll do anything. Just tell me what to do, Tammy said, feeling more afraid than she had ever felt in her life. So eager to please, the gunman said, tilting his head. The way in which he looked at her made Tammy extremely uncomfortable. I'm thinking I want more than what I came for. What do you want? Tammy asked in a hushed whisper. Customers were still moving about the store, completely oblivious to the fact that they were involved in a robbery. Money, honey, the man laughed, his voice raspy. All the cash you got. Tammy opened the cash register and with shaking hands pulled out all the money before tossing it onto the counter for him to take. I might look dumb, but I ain't stupid. The money in your safe as well. He used his gun to point to the safe that was at Tammy's feet. Her breath caught, wishing she had gone to the bank that morning. She always banked the takings on Saturdays, but now he would take her entire week's income. The hesitation was clearly evident on her face. Suddenly, a shot was fired and Tammy jumped. All right, I'll get it. I'll get it. The customers streamed out of the shop in panic. Tammy looked over at the back of the store to see that Mabel was still unharmed. Relief washed over her. No amount of money was worth a life, she reasoned, as she fell to her knees and began to work the combination on the safe. When the metal clinked, she turned the knob and opened the heavy door. She used one of the bags on the floor and began stuffing her week's earnings into the bag. In the back of the safe was a gun. Her eyes kept returning to the gun, wondering if she would have the courage to use it. At the last moment, she reached for it and hid it under her cardigan as she stood up with the bag of money. "Yeehaw! We've cleaned them out. Let's get out of here," the man cried out to his partner. Before Tammy knew what was happening, shots began to ring through the air. Both robbers were shooting wildly, aiming at nothing in particular. Between shots, the one cried out, "You never saw us, but if anyone asks, we're the brothers." Only then did Tammy see Mabel lying on the floor, clutching her leg. A dark stain spread on the wooden floor. Tammy had never thought she would ever be angry enough to fire a weapon, but without a second thought, she pulled out the revolver and aimed at the man holding the bag of money. "Leave now, or your partner will be leaving alone. You got your money, so go on. Git." The man began to laugh, making it clear he didn't think that she would have the courage to pull the trigger. Tammy closed her eyes and pulled the trigger, the loud explosion of the gun causing her to drop it to the floor. "She's crazier than a donkey in heat," one of the gunmen cried out before he and his fellow bandit rushed out of the store. Tammy glanced at the gun on the floor and knew she would think about it later, but right now she needed to get to Mabel. Tammy rushed towards the back of the store and Mabel. "Mabel?" Tammy asked, falling to her knees. "Are you all right?" Mabel's face was pale with pain. "He got me. Thought he missed until I felt the sting." Tammy didn't hesitate. She pulled Mabel's skirt up to see the gunshot wound on Mabel's leg. She ripped a piece of her own skirt and quickly tied a tourniquet above the wound. She wasn't sure if what she was doing was right, but the volume of blood pooling around Mabel caused Tammy to realize that she needed to stop the bleeding. "Ouch!" Mabel cried out as Tammy tightened it. "I know it hurts, Mabel. I'll go fetch Jake," Tammy said, pushing herself up from the floor. She was about to run out of the store when Jake ran in. "Tammy, are you hurt? Where were you shot?" Jake asked, wasting no time in giving her a quick once-over with his eyes. Tammy shook her head. I'm fine. It's Mabel. They got her in the leg. I tried to stop the bleeding." Jake nodded, even as he noticed Mabel in the back. He raced to kneel beside her. "How bad is the pain, Mabel?" "Pretty bad," Mabel said with a weak smile. "It burns. Never thought it would burn." "It's your nerve endings that are exposed," Jake said as he began to work on the wound. He asked Tammy to hand him items from his bag, and she did as she was told. But the blood wouldn't stop coming. He removed a piece of shrapnel with forceps and held it up. "I don't think there's more, but the bleeding won't stop. Do you have gunpowder?" Tammy nodded and rushed to the shelf where the gunpowder was kept. She returned moments later and was visibly confused when Jake began sprinkling a little into the wound. "Oh boy," Mabel said, her eyes widening. Jake handed her a piece of wood from his bag before pulling out a match. "Bite on this, Mabel." Mabel did as she was told, but Tammy still wasn't sure what was going on. "Jake, what?" Before she could finish, he lit the gunpowder and small flames danced on Mabel's leg for a moment. The scent of burnt meat and gunpowder filled the air. "Why did you do that?" Tammy asked, horrified. Mabel gasped for breath as she took the piece of wood out from between her teeth. "It cauterizes the wound. Quickest way." Mabel is right. If we had a fire close by, I would have used a blade instead. "See, the bleeding has stopped," Jake said, cleaning the wound again. To her surprise, there was indeed no more blood oozing from the wound. "Thank heavens. Thank you, Jake, if you hadn't come." "Don't thank me. You did well, Tammy. Putting a tourniquet above the wound was the best thing you could do," Jake said as he began bandaging Mabel's leg. "Where did you learn that?" I just," Tammy shrugged. "Well, you've got a natural feel for helping people. It doesn't surprise me that you would think of that." Jake stood up and Tammy walked him to the door. "How much did they get away with? Someone said you shot at them?" Tammy laughed nervously, adrenaline still rushing through her veins. "My whole week's income. And yes, I did shoot, although it was more to scare them off than to kill any one of them." "Well, it worked. They raced out of town in a cloud of dust. The sheriff and a few men set off after them." Jake searched her gaze before he tenderly brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Mabel will be fine, Tammy." "How are you doing?" "A little shaken, I suppose," Tammy admitted. Jake smiled at her, and it felt again as if there were unsaid words between them. For a few moments, their eyes held. The sheriff will want a statement when he returns. Why don't you help Mabel home? I'd like her off that leg for a few days at least. Will do, Doc, Tammy said with a smile. Jake frowned. I think that's the first time you called me Doc. It sounds wrong somehow. Tammy shrugged. It does. Goodbye, Jake. Tammy watched him leave and knew that tonight she would be praying for God to bless Jake and to help her figure out what was unsaid between her and him. Chapter 13. I feel like such a fool. Tammy laughed self-consciously as she hid her face with her hands. It happens to all of us, Jake said as he gently inspected her foot. If you wanted to move furniture around, why didn't you just ask for help? Tammy shrugged. I'm trying to be independent, if you haven't noticed. Jake held her foot in his hands and smiled up at her with a doubtful look. Being independent doesn't mean you can't ask for help. Last month, when I ripped my surgery coat with the scalpel, you offered to sew it for me. Does that mean I'm not independent? Tammy laughed, remembering the incident. Jake hadn't even realized he had ripped his coat until he came into the store at 4 o'clock with a large, gaping tear on one side. That was different. I used to be a seamstress. When she and Jake bantered like they were now, she wondered if Mabel wasn't perhaps right. More than once, Mabel had said that Jake only used to come into the store once or twice a week, whereas now he was in there almost daily. Should she read something into that, like Mabel was, or were they simply just friends? Jake frowned. So because I wasn't a furniture mover before, I can't help you? That's not. Ouch! Tammy cried out when he applied pressure to one of the smaller bones in her foot. Yup, looks like a tiny fracture, Miss Independent. This time, when he looked at her, it was with mischief and teasing in his eyes. Tammy shook her head. That's horrible. Jake sighed heavily in agreement. We'll have to stabilize it, and you'll have to stay off it for at least 4 months. It will need to be raised for most of the day, and unfortunately, I don't have any pain medication at the moment. I'm still waiting for a delivery. Tammy's eyes widened with horror. Jake, but what about the store? The orders? I can't be on my back for 4 months. Jake shrugged. Take this as a life lesson, Tammy. Stop trying to be independent when it isn't necessary, or fate will render you completely dependent. Tammy sighed. Oh shoot, did I really have to move that dresser? It was perfectly fine where it was. Now I can't even move it back. Jake stood up with a shake of his head. I would have offered to move it for you, but I don't want to offend you. So what happens now? Tammy asked, looking at her bruised foot. It didn't look that bad, but Jake was the doctor and she trusted his opinion. Now you get up and go back to your shop and holler if you need help moving something, Jake said with a cocky grin. But my foot. Tammy trailed off, wondering if he was going to do something about the fracture. Your foot will be perfectly fine. A small fracture like that usually heals by itself. Just keep a little weight off it for the first few days. I'm going to wrap your foot to make sure it doesn't swell too much. Other than that, you're good to go. Tammy gasped, her eyes narrowed with playful anger. You oaf! You had me worrying for no reason at all. Jake laughed. I had to scare you into not moving furniture on your own. Tammy reached for a cloth beside her and tossed it at him. He grabbed it and smiled at her in a way that made her heart race. I'll go fetch some bandages. As soon as Jake disappeared around the corner, she pressed her cool hands to her flushed cheeks. For the first time, she recognized the feeling and the unsaid words. It had happened to her before, a long time ago when she had first gone to stay with Wayne and his mother. Over time, she had fallen for him. At first, it was friendly banter and meaningful looks, until neither of them could deny their feelings any longer. Now, Tammy realized she was falling again. This time, she was falling for Jake. Her breath caught at the thought, just as Jake came around the corner. Actually, I do have something for the pain, Jake smiled, thinking her gasp was pain-related. Tammy smiled gratefully and quickly looked away. He bandaged her foot and tapped it lightly when he was done. Come on, up you get. I'll help you back to the store. Tammy did as she was told. When he slipped an arm around her waist to help her hobble across the road, she felt his touch to be warm. When they reached the mercantile store, Jake made sure she was steady on the porch before he searched her eyes. "I'll be around later to move that dresser back." Tammy was about to argue when he winked at her and crossed the road. She let out a huge sigh, wondering what she was going to do. Here she was running the store of the man she was supposed to marry, only to be falling in love with another. She smiled wryly up at the sky. "Lord, you sure have a way of surprising me with the unexpected." She hadn't heard Mabel come out until her voice spoke beside her. The unexpected is usually the best surprise. Mabel looked at Jake walking away and smiled knowingly. "Come on, dear. Let's get you inside and off that foot." Chapter 14. "Here he comes again. Twice a day this week," Mabel said with a wink before she disappeared into the back of the store. Tammy glanced at the clock on the wall and saw that it was almost closing time. It was unlike Jake to come by at this time of the day. "Hello, Jake." Jake stepped through the door with a wide smile. "I see that foot is all healed. Must be my wonderful skills as a doctor." Tammy couldn't help but laugh. "Either that or the way you made me fear for my life with a fake diagnosis." Jake shrugged before he leaned on the cash-out counter. "Perhaps. I've got a bit of a problem that I need your help with." "You do?" Tammy asked, surprised. Jake was a capable and respected man in town, and she never thought he'd come to her for help, except if it was sewing-related, of course. "Yes, I've been thinking about that conversation we had about being independent. I have some questions I need you to clear up for me. The diner is serving meatloaf, so I thought I might spare you a night of cooking and take you there instead?" Jake asked hopefully. Tammy's heart skipped a beat, even as her mouth curved into a smile. "You're inviting me to dinner. To clear up the matter, of course?" Jake smiled with half a shrug. "Yup, something like that." He turned and searched the store for Mabel, who was out of sight but close enough to be eavesdropping. "Mabel, would you mind locking up?" Mabel stepped out from behind an aisle with a knowing look. "I wouldn't mind at all." Tammy couldn't help but chuckle. "Very kind of you." Jake waited until Tammy came around the counter before dazzling her with a smile. Although they were both pretending that the evening out was only about having a conversation, they both knew that they were in actual fact going on a date. Something she never had with Wayne, or with any other man. For that matter, her heart was fluttering and her tummy doing somersaults as they walked down the boardwalk to the diner. When they reached the diner, Jake opened the door for her. Tammy smiled up at him, feeling quite privileged to be dining out with the town doctor. She was barely through the door when she realized all eyes in the diner had turned to them. She felt Jake's hand rest on the small of her back before he whispered behind her, "Don't pay them no bother." He led her to the closest open table and pulled out a chair for her. Tammy sat down, feeling all the patrons in the diner suddenly talking in hushed voices. She couldn't seem to calm her racing heart until Jake's voice penetrated her discomfort. "Tammy, look at me. We've got nothing to hide. It's better we share dinner here than at our homes. That would only tarnish your reputation." His voice was quiet and gentle and coaxing. "I know, it just feels... I've never done this before," Tammy admitted quietly. Jake's laughter floated to her over the table. "You've been married and we're about to get married again, and you've never had dinner with a man before?" Tammy was about to nod when she began to laugh. "Of course I've had dinner with a man before, just not like this." Jake's hand slipped over the table, but he pulled it back just as fast. "Now, holding your hand would raise some eyebrows. So about this independence thing, is it a forever thing or just for the moment thing?" Tammy thought for a moment when the server arrived. Both she and Jake ordered the meatloaf with coffee. Once the server left, Tammy let out a sigh. "I think it comes from childhood, to be honest. My father, he wasn't a very dependable person. Then when I had Wayne, I never had to worry about anything. After his passing, I realized I knew nothing. I didn't know about the bills, the cost of living, the taxes. I was drowning for a while. Right at my lowest point, I promised myself I would never drown again." She expected Jake to argue, but he smiled instead, with understanding in his gaze. "You do know that being in a relationship or married doesn't mean you have to be shielded or kept in the dark." He took a sip of his coffee before he met her gaze again. You can be taken care of and still be part of the decision-making. That's the type of relationship I'd like to have one day. He let the words trail off, leaving the rest unsaid. With you, Tammy hadn't thought finding love would ever be possible after Karl's death. With the running of the store and all the responsibilities she now had on her shoulders, she wasn't sure she would ever have the time. But now, as always, a lot was left unsaid. The mere fact that Jake had invited her out to dinner at least gave her hope that Jake might just have feelings of affection for her as well. She was afraid to voice her feelings or even to admit them to herself. But perhaps after a few more dinners or a few more conversations, she would know if Jake felt the same way. She had been let down by life in the past and didn't want to suffer that pain again. Even if Jake did feel the same way she did she really want to risk her heart again? She remembered how shattered she had been after Wayne's death and wondered if she would be able to survive such a loss again. "Tammy, your food is growing cold," Jake interrupted her thoughts. "I didn't mean to offend or frighten you off." No, it isn't that at all. I guess I'm just tired," Tammy said, pushing her food around on her plate. "The meatloaf is good tonight," Jake said with some pleasure. Tammy laughed at the change of subject. "You'd know, wouldn't you? You eat here on most nights unless you succumb to your sweet tooth." Jake smiled. "That's why you shouldn't shop at the same mercantile all the time. They know too much." Tammy smiled. "There is only the one mercantile in town. The best," Jake winked. For a moment, the doubts disappeared, and Tammy remembered the dream she'd had in Boston. Could it be that the reason God had brought her to Sanderson had less to do with Karl and more to do with the handsome doctor smiling back at her right now? Chapter 15. Tammy couldn't seem to wipe the grin off her face as she held the small posy of wildflowers. She reached for the note, and her heart simply stopped with joy. "Join me for a picnic at the creek. It's a quiet day, and I'd rather spend it with you than watch the store from my window." "Thank you, Lucas," Tammy said, handing the boy who had brought her the flowers a boiled sweet as a reward and a thank you. Over the last 6 weeks, she and Jake had shared numerous meals at the diner and had taken a good many walks together as well. Had Tammy not known any better, she would have thought they were courting. But surely when you were being courted, a man made his intentions clear? Or did he? She felt so out of her depth with the whole situation that she decided to stop overthinking it and just enjoy every moment she had with Jake. He was right. It was a quiet afternoon. Quiet enough that there wasn't even a single customer in the store. She had told Mabel to take the afternoon off, since her leg was still giving her trouble whenever she spent too much time on it. Although she didn't deduct it from her wages, Mabel worked only half days most since she'd been shot. Tammy didn't mind at all since she felt partly responsible for Mabel's injury. Mabel was working for her when it happened, after all. Injured while working in the store. She took the money out of the cash register and was about to put it in the safe when she heard footsteps sounding at the back of the store. Just as she was about to stand up to see who was there, a man came walking towards her. Tammy felt chills running down her spine as fear clutched her heart with a tight fist. "You?" The man snarled at her. "Yeah, it's me. Now why don't you open up that safe, or didn't you learn the first time around?" Tammy knew stubbornness was going to get her hurt, but she wouldn't be robbed twice by the same robber. "You shot Mabel," Tammy accused him in a low voice. "What did she ever do to you?" "Collateral damage. Out here in the West, we take what we need. A man builds his own dreams. Now enough talking. Get the money," he demanded while pointing towards the open safe with his gun. Tammy considered reaching for the gun again, but remembered what had happened the last time. She wasn't sure where Lucas was and if he was still on the boardwalk. She wouldn't risk more collateral damage, and she wouldn't allow herself to be walked all over yet again. "No, you can find a different place on which to build your dreams." "Sanderson doesn't want you here," Tammy said in a firm voice, realizing that she had become part of the town and its community. "Is that so? Well, I ain't going nowhere without what you've got in that safe." He moved closer, and Tammy felt her heart kick into motion as adrenaline rushed through her veins. She stood in front of the safe and jutted out her chin. "No, I knew you were back there. I've already sent for the sheriff. He'll be here any moment," she lied through her teeth. "In that case, enough chit-chat." His grin spread, and before Tammy knew it, a splitting pain shot through her skull, right before everything went black. Chapter 16. Jake glanced down at the ring between his fingers and felt excitement race through his body. He knew it was wrong at the time, but from the very moment he laid eyes on Tammy, something seemed to have slipped into place. At first, he had kept his distance, knowing it wouldn't be appropriate to court a grieving woman, although she and Karl had never been married. But over the last 6 weeks, since that very first night on which they ate meatloaf together at the diner, Jake had fallen for Tammy with all his heart. He had thought it might just be an infatuation, but it wasn't. It was her kindness, her generosity, the way her smile lit up a room, and more importantly, it was the way he felt when he was around her. He felt like he was the best version of himself. He wanted to be that person for the rest of his life. He wanted to ask Tammy to spend the rest of hers with him. Today had been carefully planned. With Mabel's help, he had sent word around town that no one should go to the store that afternoon. He had kept an eye on the store, and just as he had hoped, it was deadly quiet. Earlier that morning, he had gone to the creek to pick the wildflowers that had just burst into bloom. Then he had written the note that he asked Lucas to take to Tammy on his behalf. Now, all that was left to do was to put the picnic basket in the wagon, remember the ring, and wait for Tammy to join him. With the help of the ladies at the diner, he had managed to pack a seasonal variety of fresh picnic fare, including freshly pressed lemonade and an assortment of cheeses. The variety had cost him quite a packet, since most of the items had to be delivered from the next town, but it would be worth it. Tammy was worth it. After packing the basket, a blanket, and a few more items onto the back of his wagon, he glanced down the road at the mercantile store. The door was still open, although Jake hadn't seen anyone go in since the boy who had delivered the flowers and note and then left. Jake checked his pocket watch and decided that she was probably just closing up and maybe changing into something less formal for their picnic. He waited another 5 minutes until he couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. She wouldn't have gone to the house without locking up the store first, and the door was still wide open. He sauntered closer, not wanting to rush her, but concern mounted with every passing second. He was about 100 yards from the mercantile store when he saw a man run out of the store and to the horse he had tied to a hitching post across the thoroughfare. He had a bag under one arm and a pistol in his hand. Fear and adrenaline coursed through Jake as he began to run. All he could think of was Tammy. He didn't have to look twice to know that this man was from out of town. He also didn't have to guess what was in the bag he stuffed into his saddleback before mounting his horse. As the horse galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, Jake ran into the mercantile store. "Tammy?" he cried out with worry as he glanced around the empty store. He couldn't see her, and she wasn't answering him, which caused him all the more concern. Jake stopped for a moment to catch his breath when he saw her foot sticking out from behind the checkout counter. Within seconds, he had moved around the counter and was at her side. She lay unconscious, cramped into the small space. She had a bruise forming on her head, and regardless of him calling her name over and over again, Tammy failed to respond. The doctor in him pushed his emotions aside as he began to do a quick assessment. He checked her pupils, felt her pulse, and made sure her breathing was normal before he began to lift her. She weighed barely more than a feather, Jake thought, as he held her in his arms. Her head fell back, completely oblivious in her unconscious state. Jake wasn't sure how hard the knock on her head had been, but he prayed that a little smelling salt would wake her once he had her inside the surgery. He carried her out of the mercantile and across the road, wishing there had been someone within earshot to send after the robber. "Tammy, please, Tammy, you have to hang on," Jake pleaded as he walked. "Lord, please don't let this be it. Don't take her away from me. She still has so much life to live. There is so much I want to give her that I want to share with her." Please, Lord, help me to wake her, help me to care for her, and help me to bring her back. Jake's prayer was desperate as he walked into the surgery and made his way to the recovery room. He set her gently on the bed, and she didn't move. He rushed into the surgery to find his smelling salts and held them beneath her nose. Usually, when he used smelling salts to revive a patient, it barely took a few seconds. But Tammy didn't even flinch. Jake felt helpless, not knowing what else he could do. The woman he loved with all his heart lay limp and unconscious before him, and for the first time in his profession as a doctor, Jake knew there was nothing to be done except to wait and pray. Chapter 17. Tammy could hear voices in the distance, but as had happened before, the darkness swallowed her before she could open her eyes. Although she wasn't aware of time or place, she had been in and out of consciousness over the last 2 days. Janet and Michael had been by to see her several times, saying prayers for her recovery at her bedside. Mabel had come to pay her a visit, begging her to get better because she felt guilty for not being there when the robbers returned. The town had held a vigil in the church the night before, praying for Tammy's recovery and for the robber to be brought to justice before he paid another visit to their small, usually peaceful town. Only Tammy wasn't aware of any of this. It was as if a thick fog had taken over her mind, and every time she tried to fight her way through, she found the fog clouding her thoughts and swallowing her within its darkness all the more. Again, she managed to fight her way through and felt a pounding headache had taken residence in her skull. The pain was so bad that it made her eyes flinch, but she couldn't manage to open them just yet. She tried to think beyond her vision and her pain and drew in a deep breath when she heard Jake's voice. His soothing baritone voice made her breathe easier, knowing that she wasn't alone. The memory of the last few days returned, and Tammy remembered the sharp pain to her skull before everything went black. Had she been shot? Struck? She couldn't remember. All she knew was that she refused to allow the fog to drag her under again. Instead, she focused on Jake's voice until she could understand the words. There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Jake paused for a moment before he continued with a prayer. God, please let this be a time for healing, not a time for death. Let this be a time for the celebration of our love and not a time for saying goodbye. I beg of you, Lord, I love this woman with all my heart. Please heal her. Please let her come back to me. You gave me the skills to heal the sick, but some matters are in your hands alone. Only you can heal the injury Tammy has suffered, Lord. Only you, Lord. Please, let me love her. Let me marry her. Let me spend my life thanking you for bringing her back. Tammy felt a tear spill from her eyes. Although the headache was making it hard to concentrate, joy was making her heart swell with love. She had hoped that Jake felt this way, but she could never have imagined that he would declare his love for her so flagrantly to the Lord. Only a man who knew his own heart would have the courage to do that. She tried to open her eyes, and although they fluttered at first, she finally managed to keep them open. Jake was sitting on a chair beside her bed with a Bible open in his hands. Tears were quietly streaming over his cheeks. He didn't even bother to brush them away. Her mouth curved into a smile, knowing that she loved him in exactly the same way. She wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. She wanted to spend her life thanking the Lord for giving her another chance at happiness. Jake, her voice was raspy, her throat dry. Jake sniffed and turned to her as if he had imagined hearing her, and then he gasped and reached for her hand. Tammy? What verse was that? Tammy asked sleepily, the pain growing stronger with every waking moment. It's Ecclesiastes 3:1-8. It brought you back to me. I just know it did. Let me take a look at you, Jake said, quickly falling into the role of physician. Tammy patiently waited until he was done checking her pupils and her blood pressure. He gently probed the bruise on her head. Was I shot? Tammy asked, hoping this wasn't just a last hurrah. No, my love, you weren't shot. You just suffered a terrible blow to the head. You had a concussion. If it's as severe as this one, your body's way of healing is to keep you unconscious so it can focus on healing your brain, Jake explained patiently. Clever body, then. Tammy smiled weakly. I enjoyed listening to you. Jake frowned even as he wrapped her hand in both of his. What did you hear? Tammy blinked slowly, fighting off the sleep. That you love me. I do, Tammy. I was going to take you to the picnic to tell you just that. I love you with all my heart. I want you to spend the rest of your life with me. I even have a ring. I don't know where it is right now, but please just tell me you feel the same. Jake rambled as if he was afraid that she was going to fall asleep again. Tammy nodded. It's nice to hear, especially since I want to spend the rest of my life with you as well. She closed her eyes as the headache pounded even harder. I just went to get rid of this headache first. I'm such a fool. I should have thought. I'll go get you something for the pain, Jake said, moving as he spoke. He returned with laudanum and offered it to her. No, I don't want to sleep again, Tammy said weakly. Just a little to help with the pain. I promise you'll wake up, Jake said confidently. You have to because I want to marry you. Tammy accepted the medication simply because she was desperate for the pain to ease. Before she dozed off, she smiled at Jake with sleepy eyes. I'm going to hold you to that. Chapter 18. Tammy stood in front of the mirror and couldn't help but shed a tear of happiness. The last time she had married, her dress had been a simple day dress, because she had not been able to afford anything as luxurious as the beautiful wedding dress that Janet had gifted her on this occasion. This time, they wouldn't go to the chapel and get wed in a hurry before her husband had to leave for his shift at the docks. No, they would have a wonderful wedding with the entire town of Sanderson in attendance. They were having a reception at the diner, and of course meatloaf would be on offer. It was the perfect wedding, but most of all, Tammy was grateful because it was with the perfect man. After her concussion, he had cared for her until she was back to her normal self. Although she still had headaches now and then, she didn't allow it to interfere with the happiness she felt inside. Janet and Michael had offered for her to get ready at their home since it was closer to the church. Because Tammy didn't have her father around, the mayor offered to walk her down the aisle. It still amazed her that she had become such an integral part of the small town of Sanderson. She wasn't the newcomer anymore. She was Tammy, who owned the mercantile. She was the doctor's fiancée, and today she would become the doctor's wife. Tammy opened the door and stepped out only to hear Janet gasp. You look even more amazing than I did. Oh, Tammy, what a wonderful day to get married. Tammy smiled. I know, isn't it? It was a hot summer's day, and although most everyone was complaining about the heat, Tammy enjoyed every second of it. After living her life in Boston, Tammy hadn't known what it felt like not to be cold in winter. She had become accustomed to the more temperate weather of Texas, and she would never miss Boston. Every now and then she thought of her parents, but not long enough to regret leaving. She had tried to make amends with them, but they had made it clear that they wanted nothing to do with her. She kept them in her prayers and often wondered how they were doing, but Tammy couldn't spend her life fearing her father. No, she wanted to spend her life with a man like Jake. A man who loved her unconditionally, one whom God had brought to her in a dream. A man who was patient, kind, and generous. A man who had once declared his love for her through prayer, directly to God. We'd better get going. The mayor is waiting for you out front. Everyone is already seated, Janet said while pulling her gloves over her fingers. Tammy nodded. Jake is smiling like a fool, Janet laughed. Who would have thought you'd snag the most eligible man in town? Definitely not me. Tammy laughed as they walked to the church. Janet slipped inside to take her seat as Tammy took her place beside the mayor. He gave her a warm smile and then the doors were opened, and Tammy walked down the aisle of the church for the first time in her life as the bride. Every eye in the church was on her, but Tammy only had eyes for one person, the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. Jake's hair was neatly combed, his dress suit brand new, and his smile holding the promise of a beautiful life. She kept walking, even as she thanked the Lord in her prayers. There had been so many times in her life that she had doubted the plans he had for her life. So many times she had thought that he had abandoned her. But now she only had to look at the townsfolk cheering her on, at her new friends, and at Jake to know that every challenge she had faced in the past was necessary because it was leading her to this very moment in time. When she reached the front of the church, the mayor took his seat, and Michael welcomed her in his role as pastor. She turned and met Jake's gaze, seeing her future in his eyes. She vaguely heard Michael's sermon about love and patience, but all she could think of was all the blessings that the future would hold. "Do you, Jake, take Tammy to be your wife?" Michael asked, breaking through her thoughts. Jake took Tammy's hand and offered her a beaming grin. "I sure do." "And do you, Tammy, take Jake to be your husband?" Tammy laughed. "With all my heart." "Then I guess, Jake, it's time for you to kiss your bride." Michael laughed. The whole community cheered as Jake lightly brushed a kiss over her lips. He didn't pull away, but remained close as he whispered a promise in her ear. "I promise you will never regret today. I'm going to be the best husband." Tammy smiled. "I know that I won't regret it. I love you, Jake." He pulled her close for a hug, and in that moment, Tammy knew that she had finally found her happily ever after. She had needed to suffer her father's abuse to be rescued by Wayne. She had needed to love Wayne to know that love existed. She needed to lose Wayne to remember to appreciate it. Had it not been for Karl, she would never have come to Sanderson, and she would never have had the opportunity to start a brand new life, and she would never have met Jake. As they walked up the aisle as a married couple, Tammy knew that she would never question the challenges God brought across her path. No, not ever again. She had faced so many impossible obstacles and been let down by so many people, the very people who should have put her first in their lives. Could it be that God was only laying the groundwork so that she would know for certain when she met the man whom God had intended for her? Could it be that she was meant to start a family here in small-town Texas, blessed in abundance as she had been, through unbelievable trial and circumstance? Could it be that her happily ever after had been at the end of a road that was always predestined for her? Epilogue. The sun's beams danced on her skin in the early morning light. Tammy knew it was time to get up, but she wanted to stay in bed for just a few moments longer. As she did every morning of her life, she thanked the Lord for the blessings bestowed on her and for her wonderful life before she even fully woke up. Somewhere in the house she could hear scuffling and noise, but it had become part of everyday life over time. Having 3 children in 5 years was no easy feat, but Tammy wouldn't have had it any other way. Jake was a wonderful father, and although Tammy often doubted that she was a good mother, like any mother did, she loved her children with all her heart, even if it meant that she hardly slept anymore. Olivia, at the age of 4, was the light of her father's life. Not only did she resemble him in appearance, but she resembled him in personality as well. Her dolls were always suffering some kind of malady for which she simply had to find a treatment. As for Wayne, whose second name was Karl, named for the men that had led Tammy to Jake, he was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity. Tammy was always either keeping the incorrigible 3-year-old from getting hurt, running off, or trying to get him to sit quietly for more than 5 minutes at a stretch. She didn't know who he took after, but Tammy loved feeding off his energy to get her through the day. Then there was Wendy. At only 9 months old, Wendy had a calmness that astonished most of the mothers in town. Wendy hardly ever cried, never fussed when it was time to sleep, and simply loved the company of her siblings. Tammy could still remember a time when she felt as if she had no one in the world. Now she had a beautiful, busy, and demanding family. Although she still owned the mercantile, She had appointed a manager who now lived next to the mercantile store and managed it by day. Tammy wouldn't voice her suspicions, but as of late, it was clear that the store manager, a middle-aged man, had more interest in Mabel than he did in the store. With the town's population growing by the month, Jake's surgery was busier than ever before. Tammy was not only proud of his dedication to his profession, but for the way he never refused to help anyone in need, even if they couldn't afford his services. "Ma, come on, get up. We're going on the versary picnic," Olivia said, blowing into the room like a whirlwind. Tammy had barely opened her eyes when Wayne jumped on the bed and started to shake her. "It's versary day! It's versary day!" Tammy laughed as she stretched. "It's anniversary. It's the day Pa and I got married. 5 years today." "I remembered," Jake said from the door. In one arm, he held Wendy, and in his other, a cake with 5 candles. It was moments like these that Tammy knew she had the best husband in the world. Jake had a way of making everything special, even if it meant getting a cake from the diner with which to celebrate their love, resplendent with 5 candles. Her heart overflowed with joy. "Me too." He handed Wendy to her, and once the baby was snuggled on her lap, Jake lit the candles. The older children blew the candles out, and Jake met her gaze with a smile. "Make a wish, my love." Tammy shook her head. "There isn't a single thing I would want to wish for. Everything I've always wanted is right here in this room." "No, Ma, you have to make a wish. It's the rules. Besides, if you don't, Pa won't give you your gift," Olivia protested. "Livy, the gift was supposed to be a secret," Jake reprimanded playfully. "I'll make a wish," Tammy said in order to play along gamely. "I wish that Jake would look under the bed." Jake chuckled, even as both he and Wayne quickly kneeled beside the bed. He allowed Wayne to pull the box out, but he opened it himself. Inside was a brand new doctor's coat with the words Dr. Jake embroidered smartly onto the chest. "Tammy, it's wonderful." "Thank you," Jake beamed, slipping into the coat. Tammy smiled. "Not as wonderful as the man who wears it." "Pa, give her the gift now," Olivia insisted once more. Jake and Tammy laughed that the children were more excited about their anniversary than they were. Jake shrugged and walked out of the room. When he returned a short while later, he let out a disappointed sigh. "I don't know where it is. Livy, Wayne, you'd better come help me find it." "She had it," Wayne complained. Livy put her hands on her hips with a narrowed look. "You had it last." "Children, don't argue. Come, I'll help you find it," Tammy said, pushing back the blankets. She stood up with Wendy cradled in her arms and followed Jake and the children into the living room. She saw it the moment she stepped through the door. "Jake?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know nothing about them, but apparently if you want one, that's the best one on the market. Had it brought all the way from Houston." Tammy couldn't wipe the smile from her face as she gave Wendy to Jake before rushing to her gift. She let her hand glide over the polished wood before turning to her husband. "Jake, this is a white treadle sewing machine." "I know," Jake smiled. "You once mentioned how you missed working with a sewing machine. I thought you might find it handy with all the clothes you're making for the children." Tammy's face lit up as she turned to her husband. "I never thought I'd enjoy sewing after working at the factory during my previous life in Boston. But now, can the versary picnic wait?" Jake laughed. "Unfortunately not. The basket is packed and the kids are ready. But I promise you that tomorrow you can spend the whole day sewing. In that box are some fabrics that Janet insisted I order as well. There is one condition attached to the sewing machine, though." "What condition?" Tammy asked with a frown. "The first thing you sew simply has to be a dress for yourself. You do such a good job of taking care of me and the children, but it is way overdue that you do something for yourself." Tammy smiled lovingly at her husband. This was just another way of Jake making her feel loved, cherished, and appreciated, and happy. Happily ever after.